and not have to go into an office every day, that would be awesome. And so that's kind of really what got me started in it.
Yeah, that seems to always be the thing that gets people excited in the same way it did for us as well.
You know, that's really cool that you mentioned that, because actually right before this call, immediately before this call, Sterling and I were having a chat about that very site, that how-to podcast site that's been out there now for 4 or 5 years, something that I put up and haven't touched since, literally, like in 2005. And it's still out there getting attention, building a list, and we were talking about, you know what could we do to maybe connect the dots more now? That Internet Business Mastery, now the Internet Business Mastery has become such a focus for us and taken off. How could we connect the dots and make that, even more of a lead-in or a way to attract people to the Internet Business Mastery show, and get people from there to, don't just create a show, but let's teach you how to create a business too out of this. So I guess that's a nice case in point right there. You sharing your story of that would be a good thing for us to do. We really could reach a lot of people that way if we revisit that site, that asset that's just sitting out there, and connect the dots for people. So how timely. That's very cool. I like hearing that.
Absolutely, because I remember at the time thinking that you were kind of hiding it, that you had Podcasting Underground, but you didn't really mention Internet Business Mastery.
Right.
That you were kind of trying to become separate, I think. So, yeah, break down that wall.
Right, exactly.
Well, now you mentioned that you've had, I guess, a couple of different businesses, and a lot of people have a hard time with choosing their niche. How did you go about choosing your target market?
Yeah, that's interesting. I just did what I loved, and that was really it. What I thought was interesting and what I was interested in doing. So with Distinctions for Life, that was really personal development. And I also knew I wanted to do video, because I'm always like, well, what's harder? And because it's harder, less people will do it. So I did video for that. And it turned out that it's not just that it's hard, but to do it the level I wanted to do it at, it took a lot of time to do. And then in personal development, you kind of, as one person in the forums told me when I was kind of at a stopping point on that, they're like, it's just not something you can really fake. You have to be kind of living that and having a lot of content. So that was how I had picked that niche. But then I've been into photography and into this specific genre of photography, which I call the modeling underground, or the model photography underground, which is, there's a whole kind of amateur world out there of models and photographers that shoot with one another, mostly just to produce great images, and they have different reasons for doing it, but it's sort of an amateur underground. And I knew I was part of that, and I was actually listening to another podcast, probably the biggest photography podcast out there, This Week in Photography, and one of the hosts, they had a guest on, and she said, oh yeah, I got my model off of Model Mayhem. And the guy goes, what's that? And I'm like, that's like the biggest photography podcast, and they've never heard of this. So like, there's obviously, I think I looked today, there's like 400,000 members of this site, Model Mayhem, and yet people don't know about the whole thing. So that's kind of where it kind of clicked in my head. I know this. There's obviously a lot of people involved in it. There's people who aren't involved in it who probably would like to be if they knew it existed. So that's how I picked that particular niche.
Well, that's interesting. So why do you think it is that to begin with, you went with that Distinctions for Life rather than this photography thing that, sounds like it really was a passion for you. You'd already been doing for a while, had some good knowledge in. Is that something you've thought back on? Like, not that there's a right or wrong answer. It may be that was just the right path for you to go in the end, but do you think there's a reason why initially you didn't go, yeah, you know what, the photography niche, this photography and model niche is what I should do?
That's an interesting question, and I probably had different reasons for it back then. Part of it was that I think I thought the market was bigger in personal development than in photography. I also could have been at a place in photography where I was not as into it as I am at other times. With any kind of hobby or something like that, you kind of have ups and downs of interest. It's not that you don't like it when you're down, it's just that you just don't do it as much.
Yeah.
So I'm not real sure exactly why I picked that one first, but yeah, and it's an interesting market. The photography market's interesting too, because you can't use some methods, like you can't buy advertising, for instance, because you're competing with people who sell equipment that costs over $1,000. Right? You're competing with camera manufacturers and computer manufacturers, and those guys can spend a lot of money on their advertising. So you can't come in and spend, the kind of startup capital and advertising things. You have to use a different method. And that's, like the method you guys teach. When I did find it at Business Mastery, and, that step-by-step, put up a site, start creating content, build a list, that kind of thing didn't require this big investment up front or to compete with guys who are multi-billion-dollar companies. Yeah,
that's a really powerful thing about that tactic or strategy, and that's one reason why we like it so much, that you can the phrase we use when we're talking about is you can stand with giants when you're using that content creation, magnetic media type approach to putting your brand out there and attracting followers, because they're out there really busy throwing tons and tons of money at big advertising campaigns just because that's what they've always done. But for whatever reason, they're not taking the time just to create what their market probably wants most, and that's just relevant, great content that they're going to come back over and over and over again to digest. And so that opens up for even the smallest guy, quote unquote, the small guy out there to step up and go, well, here, let me show you the tips and tricks that work for me. And, all of a sudden you're standing with the giants standing out in the crowd without having to throw all the money at the advertising budgets like those big corporations do.
Right.
Well, that's cool. That's interesting. I mean, really, I think the right answer is that you just started. You just started with, and, at the time, personal development felt right. And that's good. And, and even though you ended up shifting gears, that's actually one thing that, I remember really admiring, because I can remember the point where you were posting in the academy going, maybe this isn't the right thing. I might be shifting gears here. And I think, just the fact that you were willing to take a look at that and go, yeah, you know what? I've put the time and effort into this other thing. And yet now it seems like really for whatever reason, just because of my passions, because of where the market seems to be, or just opportunities that are presenting itself, I'm going to go ahead and start this new route. I'll put on the shelf this other thing, and now photography is the thing I'm going to go for. Was that, I'm kind of curious, was that a hard decision for you to make? Maybe talk a little bit about how you got through that decision, because I think sometimes we have a hard time going, I'm going to, I got to make this work because I've already put all this time and effort into this, going down path A. And so it's hard to take the step over and go into path B. What was that transition like for you?
Yeah, that's a thing I see with people also in the academy, is that they don't want to do it. They want to think about doing it for too long. And for instance, and I hadn't, you guys are going to be the first ones to hear this, but I'm going to start a new podcast next week in a totally different market.
Okay.
And I talked to the guy who's going to be my partner in this, or my co-host, everyone at it. It's in the EMS field, and I'm actually getting ready to start training as an EMT. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to go through this training. I should be podcasting my experience.
Right.
And what I ought to do is find someone who's way more experienced than I am. And in this case, he's actually a fairly accomplished blogger in that space. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to get together once a week and talk about what I learned in class and get his perspective on it. And when I told him about it, I was like, even if this doesn't, go on and become a big business, that's very valuable information to have out there in iTunes for people. And I told him, I said, when he said, yeah, he would do it, I said, okay, I'll set this up over the weekend. That's really, to set all this stuff up, it shouldn't take you more than 2 weeks.
Right.
I can do it in a weekend because I've done it before. I already have an AWeber membership. I already have hosting. I don't have to go buy all the pieces or, sign up for all the pieces. I can just throw up a new one. And that's kind of what I did when I went from Distinctions for Life to, at that point, it was called Glamour Apprentice. Oh, I do remember now why I didn't do photography at the beginning, and I'll come back to that if you want.
Okay.
But when I decided to switch, it was kind of like, you know what, I can set up a blog